By the late 19th century, London was the largest city on the planet. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, this was the peak of capitalism, with many factory owners making lots of money very quickly. However, just down the road from where all these rich men lived in Kensington were their poverty-stricken workers, who lived in the infamous Victorian London slums, which were rife with cholera outbreaks, rats, and typhoid. Many of the men laboured in the highly dangerous factories to make a living for their family, whilst the children were hired as chimney sweeps, where some would get trapped and die. The women sometimes turned to prostitution in order to make ends meet. One of the most famous of these slums was the expansive district of Whitechapel, one of the most notoriously cramped rookeries of poverty and crime. Whitechapel's 62 brothels housed over 1,000 sex workers, whilst mass Jewish immigration to the borough fueled racial tensions and gang activity. Known for its labyrinth of back alleys, an army of police officers patrolled the streets of the area that was known as a den of immorality. However, despite the vast police presence, a series of brutal murders gripped the Whitechapel area, beginning the late summer of 1888, would only reinforce the negative perception of Whitechapel even more. On the 31st of August 1888 at around 3:40 a.m, Charles Cross was walking down Bucks Row in Whitechapel when he saw a woman lying on her back on the ground in front of a gate to stable entrance. He rushed over to find her hands cold to touch. Her legs were straight, her eyes open, and her skirt lifted above her knees. Robert Paul came to his side and the two analysed the body. However, not wanting to be late for work, the two men left the scene after pulling her skirt back down, hoping to find a police officer on their way. This effort was, thankfully, for naught, as 5 minutes later PC John Neal happened upon the same body himself. Neal, who had a lantern so could see much better, found a large cut across the woman's throat. It was deemed to be relatively fresh, as the wound was still bleeding and different parts of the body were still warm. Another constable arrived, who grabbed a doctor, who determined that she had been dead for half an hour, which meant that Cross and Paul found the body only 10 minutes after the murder. This meant that police had only just missed the killer, as 3 police officers had patrolled the area approximately 15 minutes before the estimated time of death. She was quickly rushed to the morgue not long after, where she was identified as Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old woman with 6 children, who returned to prostitution in order to get into a lodging house she'd been denied from earlier that night. She was last seen by a close friend walking down Whitechapel Road towards where her body was found, around 800 metres from a murder site, whilst visibly drunk. This is around 2:30, only 1 hour before her death. The doctors determined that there were 2 slits to the throat, as well as a slice across the abdomen, and she had been disemboweled. Whilst no organs had been removed, the doctor still determined that the killer had a decent anatomical knowledge. Many police officers compared it to another murder early that month, that being Martha Tabram. Both women were prostitutes, killed incredibly violently and ferociously, and had no discernible motive for their respective murders, and ran the same age, with both murders taking place about a mile apart from one another. However, the difference was in the wounds. Whilst Tabram had been repeatedly stabbed, Nichols' wounds were more consistent with slashes and slices. Despite this, the police still suspected the 2 murders of being linked. In addition, the press attempts to link the Tabram and Nichols murders to the sexual assault and robbery of Emma Elizabeth Smith, who was attacked on London Street in April and died due to her injuries at London Hospital. However, the police dismissed this connection, believing it to be generic gang violence of the East End.
Each of the ill-lighted thoroughfares to which the women were decoyed to be foully butchered are off turnings from Whitechapel Road, and are all within half a mile. The fact that these 3 tragedies have been committed with such a limited area and are so strongly alike in their details is forcing on all minds the conviction that they are the work of some cool, cunning man with a mania for murder.
On September 8th, a little over a week after the first murder at 4:45 a.m, John Richardson was walking along Hanbury Street before making a stop at number 29. He walked through the cramped hallway of the residence to check the security of the basement door in the backyard before sitting down the back doorstep, where he trimmed a piece of leather from his boot. He then left the premises through the front door and closed it behind himself, continuing on his walk to work. An hour later, a tenant on the 3rd floor by the name of John Davies walked downstairs. The front door was now wide open, but now the back door was closed. Davis walked outside, only to find the body of a woman lying on her back by the fence in the yard. A doctor and a police inspector soon arrived on the scene. The doctor said that she had been, quote, terribly mutilated. The specifics include a deep cut in her throat, and her intestines had been lifted from her body and wrapped around her neck. By the woman's feet, they found a cloth and 2 combs, which are suspected to belong to the victim, but had been arranged by the murderer. At the mortuary, she was identified as Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who occupied herself with crochet work, flower selling, and casual prostitution on the side. The last official sighting of Chapman was when she was denied lodging at 35 Dorset Street due to insufficient funds. However, at 5:30, a woman named Elizabeth Long saw Chapman conversing with a man just meters away from 29 Hanbury Street. It may suspect that this man, who Long could not see as his back was facing her, was the killer. However, this creates a conflict, as doctor determined the time of death was at 4:30. Richardson claimed that when he entered the backyard at 4:45, there was no body, and it was impossible for him to have not seen it even if it was there. In addition, a resident of the neighbouring 27 Hanbury Street heard strange noises coming from the other side of the fence that divided the 2 yards of the 2 properties when he was standing in the yard at number 27 around 5:20 a.m. He simply made out the word "no" as well as a thud against the fence. The doctor did concede, saying that he mainly just a time of death based off the temperature of the body, which the coroner stated could have been affected by the cold night and massive blood loss. This has placed Chapman's death between 5:30 and 5:45 in the morning. However, this creates a chilling reality, where, with the dim light of dawn slowly creeping through the streets, the residents of 29 Hanbury Street, some of whom slept with an open window that night, would have had a clear view of the murder. However, no one was reported as having observed the murder. At the mortuary, marks were discovered on her fingers, consistent with someone aggressively taking off a ring. Other parts of the abdomen were removed and not found, including Chapman's womb. Doctors determined that, because of this, the killer must have some kind of anatomical knowledge, whether it be a surgeon, a medical student, or a butcher. Many in Whitechapel and around the world began to question the competence of the police. One article in the New York Times called London police force, quote, probably the stupidest in the world, end quote. What many failed to take into account, however, were the overwhelming odds stacked against them. They were attempting to find a man who killed and didn't leave a weapon, a motive, or witnesses. A man in the East End of London is a grain of sand, as invisible and almost as much beyond identification amid the masses. There is no material clue, and the motive was that the crime itself was its own impelling cause. The police had nothing to go upon and are reduced to endless inquiries in innumerable lodging houses, whether a man came into any of them at 6 o'clock in the morning, with blood upon his fingers and clothes. It is the last thing he would do that hour of the day, supposing him sane enough to feel fear. But what are the police to ask about? The search should be most strenuous, extending far beyond lodging houses in Whitechapel. To accuse the police of negligence or fortuity on account of failure is unfair. They must be 3 times as anxious to succeed as the public, and the public is wild with anxiety. In an attempt to stop the attacks, a man named George Lusk established the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a vigilante task force set on hunting down the killer. Due to a leather apron being found at the scene of Chapman's murder, newspapers began to suspect that a Jewish man was behind the attacks, due to a Polish Jewish bootmaker in Whitechapel called John Pizer, often being characterised by his leather apron, increasing anti-Semitic attacks throughout the borough. However, Pizer had alibis for the first 2 murders. Newspapers whipped the people up into a frenzy, which encouraged many people to write into the police officers and newspapers claiming to be the murderer. Many of these were dismissed as pranks or false allegations. However, one sent to the Central News Agency in London caught their eye. The letter, which arrived on 27th of September, read as follows in bright red ink. Dear boss, I kept on hearing the police have caught me, but it won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on a horse and I shan't quit ripping until I do get buckled. Grand what the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How could they catch me now? I love my work, I want to start again. You'll hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper bread stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send them to police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep his letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight.
My knife's so nice and sharp I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. Let's say I'm a doctor now.
The name at the bottom of the letter would ring throughout history as one of, if not the, most infamous serial killer of all time. The agency forwarded this to police, who were more skeptical. However, their opinion would soon change. On September 29th, just 2 days after the Dear Boss letter, 40 Barnett Street, the building for the International Working Men's Educational Club, a socialist and predominantly Jewish social club, was holding a meeting. The meeting came to a close and some chose to stay and drink. At midnight, Joseph Lave used the side entrance, which led into the incredibly dimly lit Dutfield's yard, to grab some fresh air. He lingered for 10 minutes, facing to Barnett Street before retreating into the building. Moments later, a man named Morris Eagle, who was a member of the club and had come back after escorting a woman home, turned right off Barnett Street into Dutfield's yard and used the same entrance into number 40. Barely 20 minutes went by before a horse and carriage, driven by Louis Deemschutz, made the same turn the Eagle did, turning right into Dutfield's yard off Barnett Street. However, once he entered the yard, his horse veered to the left. He looked down, lit a match, saw the body of a woman lying by the wall. He went inside to check on his wife before a small crowd gathered outside. They determined the woman was dead and then dispersed to find a police officer. The name of the victim was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old cleaner and prostitute. She was spotted 3 times throughout the night, with the man described as having a respectable appearance. Last one of these being at around 12:35, about 25 minutes before the body was found. The most notable sighting was by Israel Schwartz, who spotted a man violently shoving a woman in the entrance of Dutfield's yard. Schwartz crossed the street, decided not to intervene, before the man yelled, "Lipsky," which encouraged a bystander to follow Schwartz for quite some distance. Whether this was a co-conspirator, or the man was simply frightened too and happened to walk down the same way as Schwartz, is up to interpretation. This occurred only 5 minutes before the body was discovered, and it is believed that the woman was Stride, and the man shoving her was the killer. Whilst the police initially believed the alleged killer was calling upon the bystander, believing his name was Lipsky, Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline believed that the man was in fact calling Schwartz Lipsky, which had become a Jewish slur in London after the conviction and hanging of Polish Jewish murderer Israel Lipsky. Stride did not have as many brutal wounds as the other victims, with just a slit of her throat, which led many to believe that she was not actually a victim of the Ripper. However, what many believe is when Deemschutz rolled his cart down Dutfield's yard, he had inadvertently interrupted the murder, and the murderer had hidden away at the end of the alleyway. Once Deemschutz went inside to check on his wife, it is believed the murderer slipped down to the yard and went on the hunt for another victim. Later that night, around 1:45, PC Edward Watkins discovered another body on his patrol route around the area of Mitre Square, only 15 minutes away from Dutfield's yard, and 30 minutes after his previous patrol of the area. She was taken to the mortuary and identified as Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old street vendor and prostitute. Eddowes had been jailed earlier that night for being so drunk she collapsed on the pavement and was not released until 1 in the morning. 35 minutes later, she was spotted in the company of a man near an entrance to Mitre Square. The post-mortem found that she too had been disemboweled, some of her organs being removed, most notably her womb and her left kidney, reinforcing their theory that the killer had decent anatomical knowledge. What was also notable was that there had been a small incision made on her left earlobe. This indicated the murderer was attempting to cut Eddowes' ear off, as detailed in a letter before he was, once again, interrupted. This was somewhat confirmed by a postal card sent 2 days later. Whilst it was much shorter than the letter sent on the 27th, main detectives still believe this to be from the actual killer, as it was written before any information about 2 murders had been released to the public or the press.
I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not got time to get the ears off before police, thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again.
This was further corroborated by the fact that 3 notable individuals had a direct view of the murder site. A house directly across the square from the murder site was occupied by a police officer, where he slept on an upper floor with a window that overlooked the crime scene. A night watchman, a retired police officer, had been cleaning a warehouse within earshot of the murder and regularly heard officers patrolling, but heard nothing of the murder. Finally, and most tragically, PC James Harvey glanced into Mitre Square 4 minutes before the discovery of the body, looked directly at the murder, and saw nothing. In addition, 2 blocks away from Mitre Square, a piece of bloodstained cloth was found on the pavement, which was found to be a part of Eddowes' apron that she was wearing. Above it, in large sprawling text on the wall, was written, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of this is heavily debated. Was it written by the killer in an attempt to divert attention away or towards the Jewish community of London? Was it just discarded there by chance under some anti-Semitic graffiti by someone who wasn't the killer? Was the killer an anti-Semite, considering the Strides murder was outside a Jewish social club and the slowly alleged killer called Schwartz? To this day, no one knows the answer to any of these questions. No matter what the case was, Commissioner Charles Warren ordered it to be removed for fear of civil unrest. A final confirmed letter was sent to the George Lusk on the 16th of October and was redirected to the police force after its arrival. It appeared as though the handwriting was much worse than the previous two, as well as the spelling. However, some suspect that this was done on purpose to throw the police off to make the killer seem uneducated. The contents of the letter is not what made the police believe it was from the Ripper, rather the package that accompanied it.
From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried as natives was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if only you wait a while longer. Signed, capture when you can, Mr. Lusk.
With the letter, there was a parcel which, as the letter described, contained half a human kidney. There was no way confirming, however, this was actually Edwards' kidney, or something that a medical student had done as a prank. Whatever the case may be, this is what many believe to be the final letter from Jack the Ripper, and there was relative peace in London for quite some time. For over a month, not a single murder was reported, and it is believed that Jack the Ripper had simply stopped.
It becomes evident that the Whitechapel murderer has gone out of business, and it is pretty certain that despite the bravado exhibited by the Ripper in his recent letter, the monster has become frightened at the magnitude of the police arrangements for its detection and has suspended his horrible work for present, if not for good.
In the property in Miller's Court on November 9th, 1888, landlord John McCarthy had noticed that the tenant of number 13, one Mary Jane Kelly, had fallen behind on her rent. Around 10:45, he instructed his assistant, Thomas Boyer, to collect the money. Boyer knocked on the door twice and after receiving no response decided to peer through the window to see if Kelly was home. After seeing what was inside, he quickly ran to his boss and summoned him to look upon the horror in 13 Miller's Court.
The sight we saw I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. Kelly's body was lying on the bed undressed. She had been completely disemboweled and her entrails had been taken out and placed on the table. It was those that I had seen when I looked through the window and took to be lumps of flesh. The woman's nose had been cut off and her face gashed and mutilated so that she was quite beyond recognition. Both her breasts, too, had been cut clean away and placed by the side of her liver and other entrails on the table. I had heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God I had never expected to see such a sight as this. The body was, of course, covered with blood, and so was the bed. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again.
Kelly was the youngest victim. She was somewhere in the mid-20s and was, up until the start of the month, cohabitating with a man named Joseph Barnett, who split with Kelly on the 30th of October due to his disapproval of her life as a prostitute, as well as a circle she hung around with. Kelly was seen by Barnett in 13 Miller's Court on the evening of November 8th, the former of which was in the company of a woman who was on her way out the door. As many accounts conflict on this, Barnett claims he arrived anywhere between 7 and 7:45 and left before 9. At 11:45, Kelly's neighbour spotted her entering her home with a man while she was in a drunken state. She was heard singing by this same neighbour and was still singing by the time the neighbour left Miller's Court at 1 a.m. It is then alleged that she left Miller's Court and met up with George Hutchinson, asking for some spare coins, as the two were well acquainted. When Hutchinson told Kelly that he had no spare money, she walked down the street and was spotted in the company of a well-dressed man by Hutchinson. Believing the presence of such a man in the accompaniment of a woman like Kelly to be strange, he scrutinised the appearance of the man. Hutchinson then shouted the couple up to Miller's Court, whereupon the man gave Kelly a red handkerchief before being invited inside. The detail about the red handkerchief matches up with the testimony of the last person to see Edwards alive, who described the man he cited as having a reddish handkerchief tied around his neck. Hutchinson then stuck around for an hour before leaving. Once Kelly's neighbour returned around 3, there was now no sound or light coming from Kelly's room. At 4, the residents above and across from Kelly heard cries of murder from nearby, whilst other residents heard absolutely nothing at all. Doctors were unsure where to place time of death. Despite Hutchinson's testimony, some believe that he embellished the truth or simply lied in order to gain more public attention. Cersei was not helped by the fact that some witnesses described seeing and even speaking to her as late as 8 or 10 o'clock in the morning of November 9th. Kelly is largely believed to be the final victim of the Ripper.
Theories. We were almost lost in theories. There were so many of them.
If Kelly truly is the final victim of the Ripper, an obvious question arises itself. Why? What happened to make him stop? Was he imprisoned? Did he skip town? Did he die? Or maybe she wasn't the final victim. At least 4 more bodies of 4 more women, including one unidentified body, were discovered from December 1888 to February 1891, who are highly suspected of also being involved in the case. In addition, 11 other murders, either predating the murder of Nichols or after the murder of Kelly, have all at some point been attempted to link to the Ripper by experts on the case, referred to as Ripperologists. However, many of these were ruled out by the police as not having the same modus operandi as the Ripper killings. For instance, the body of Rose Myler, discovered on December 20, 1888, was initially believed to be an accidental suicide, with police suspecting she had hanged herself for a drunken stupor with her own collar. However, marked strangulation was later found that proved to be a homicide, but still not the Ripper's traditional style. Some other victims of the Thames Mysteries, a series of murders with the bodies of 4 women, 3 of which remain unidentified, were found in the embankment of the River Thames. Whilst not sharing the same modus operandi as the Ripper, some suspect these murders were also perpetrated by the Ripper, whilst the police suspect them as 2 coincidental serial killers operating at the same time in the same area. In order to ascertain a potential suspect, the police practiced a primitive form of criminal profiling, in which they tried to ascertain what sort of person the Ripper might have been before coming to any sort of conclusion about an exact identity. They came to the conclusion that the suspect was a strong, middle-aged, respectably dressed man with an inoffensive appearance. Rather controversially, Dr. Thomas Bond, who praised the profile, did not believe that the Ripper had any form of anatomical knowledge, which clashed with the ideas of his peers. He also must have either lived in or been very well versed in the labyrinthine network of the East End, in order to evade detection so narrowly on multiple occasions. He was also likely employed, as most of the murders were committed on weekends or Fridays, which also sometimes rest on public holidays. With over 100 suspects being named, it's an incredibly difficult task to narrow down who might be the man responsible for these brutal atrocities. It's highly likely that, considering a few eyewitness accounts, the suspect was at least lightly familiar with the suspects. How about we begin with, by far, the most personal relationship about the suspects to a potential killer. Barnett, a fish porter by trade, was an Irish immigrant who had cohabited with Mary Jane Kelly, the alleged final Ripper victim, until October 30th, a little over a week before her murder. The parting of the ways was the result of a fight regarding Kelly's prostitution that turned violent, with Barnett allegedly smashing a window before leaving. Another important point of order is the matter of the locked door. In order to get into the crime scene on November 9th, the police had to break down the door to 30 Mills Court with a pickaxe. So, how exactly did the killer lock the door behind himself when he left? According to Barnett, both he and Kelly would use a special system to unlock the door, as they had lost the keys a long while ago and could not afford a replacement. The practice involved reaching through a broken window adjacent to the door and unlocking the door to get in that way, as it functioned with a catch lock that meant that the door would lock itself upon closing. Even if the door was not a catch lock, the Ripper could have simply observed Kelly using the same trick and locked the door behind himself that way. However, support to this theory suggests an alternate hypothesis, that the key never went missing, and Barnett had pocketed it and used it on the night of the murder. The manner in which the clothes were folded by the bed suggests they were taken off in an ordinary way. Whilst this is evidence that Barnett could be Kelly's killer, it's not conclusive in regards to the other 4 murders. The belief is that when Barnett lost his job in the summer of 1888, that Kelly turned to prostitution to make rent. His disapproval of her lifestyle, a direct cause of the argument on October 30th, led him to murder the other women across the Whitechapel area in an effort to scare Kelly off the streets. It was also rumoured that Barnett was secretly in love with Kelly, who he once referred to as his wife, despite the fact they were, as far as we're aware, only roommates. It was also believed that Barnett had met the women prior to their murders through Kelly's social group, explaining the lack of defensive wounds as they would have let their guard down upon seeing him. In addition, much of the spelling in the From Hell letter contained what some suspect to be Irish pronunciations, but this is heavily debated. However, Barnett had no form of anatomical knowledge, as he was not a fishmonger, but a porter, which which involved largely moving produce around. Other than this highly circumstantial, heavily debated, and speculative evidence, there is no proof of Barnett being the Ripper. The form of sadistic obsession with mutilation, as clearly shown by Kelly's murder, would not match up with someone who, even despite their disagreements, did care for Kelly, and had zero record of a violent or criminal history. Kłosowski was a Polish immigrant to London who was convicted of the murder of 3 women in London's East End between 1897 and 1902. During his time in the UK, he adopted the name of George Chapman, which is unrelated to the victim Annie Chapman as far as investigators are aware. When Chapman was caught in 1903, Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline reportedly cried, "You've got the Ripper at last." According to an interview that Aberline did with Pall Mall magazine, Aberline interviewed Chapman's first wife, who stated that he would often go out in the area of Whitechapel for hours at a time once night fell. Whilst writers at the time were more convinced by this lead, modern writers aren't as convinced. However, 2 things about Chapman do hold up the case. He was violent, and he was a misogynist. He was known to beat his wives, especially strangling his first wife during her time living in the United States, and threatened that he would behead her. He arrived in Whitechapel shortly before the first murders, and the murders stopped, and he left the country to move to the United States. He also strongly matched the physical description given about the man in the company of Kelly on the night of her murder. However, the main issue arises from the fact that such a grand shift in modus operandi, from mutilating slashes of people seemingly unknown to him to poisoning acquaintances, is unusual for a serial killer to make. In addition, it is not known if Chapman could speak English during his time in London, especially not as well as some passers-by described the killer as sounding like, as well as the lack of intimate knowledge of Whitechapel streets the Ripper clearly possessed, which many argue that a recent immigrant would not have, especially considering that his place of residence, while still in Whitechapel, was not particularly near any of the murders. Chapman was hanged for the murders he did commit in Wandsworth Prison. Sir William Gull was a physician to Queen Victoria after having successfully helped the Prince of Wales, who had become King Edward VII, to recover from a bad case of typhoid. He was given a baronetcy by the Queen and helped advance multiple medical fields such as the condition of anorexia and paraplegia. However, Gull is now known for a much different reason. After the murders and his death in 1890, multiple American newspaper outlets reported that a prominent London physician was responsible for the murders. In the 1970s, Thomas E.A. Stowell hypothesized that one of Gull's patients was the murderer. Whilst he made specific care not to name the patient, it is highly suspected that he was referring to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, and the eldest son of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. Stowell hypothesized that his contraction of syphilis during a tour of the West Indies induced insanity, causing him to commit the murders. Another theory, crafted by Joseph Gorman, who was the self-proclaimed illegitimate son of artist and Ripper suspect Walter Sickert, postulates that Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, a group of senior Freemasons, and the Queen conspired to kill a number of women who had knowledge of an illegitimate heir of Prince Albert Victor. Gull, an alleged Freemason himself, was eventually pushed forward in a book by Stephen Knight published in 1976 as the actual man behind the killings. Whether he was as high-ranking as Gorman or Knight portrayed him to be is highly contested. Gorman himself later retracted his statement in an interview with the Sunday Times and stated that he had made the whole thing up. Whilst Gull did have the anatomical skill required to pull off such an act, he was far too old to match any physical description of the Ripper and was already in ill health before the murder started. From 1887 to 1890, Gull suffered several strokes before passing away in January of 1890. Over 150 years have passed and no one is a single step closer to finding any suspect that can conclusively be proven as the Ripper. The hundreds of named suspects range from the dull and inconspicuous, to the psychopathic and murderous, to the outlandish and bizarre. Whilst recent DNA tests have been conducted, they were inconclusive at best and fraudulent at worst. The police highly suspect the Ripper was a citizen of the area due to the close calls, especially those of Dutfield's Yard, Mitre Square, and Bucks Row. Census data, especially in the slums, was dire. So it's more likely than not that Jack the Ripper, whether he be a doctor, medical student, butcher, or anything alike, might have just slipped out their hands and blended into the chaos of the East End like a grain of sand.